I think all of you know me. I am David Schmidt, lifelong resident of the South Dayton area. Been active with the Historical Society for maybe about 10 years now. I have a background in geology and I love local history. Tonight's discussion is Oakwood History 101. And so this is intended to be a broad brush overview of those aspects of Oakwood's history, the people, places, and events that I think are important, at least for Oakwood's history. We only have about an hour, and so 225 years of history compressed, into 60 minutes or so. The first traces we have of human inhabitants in this area go back to the mound builder tribes that were here roughly a couple thousand years ago. This is an Indian mound that stood over in what was called the Hatcher Plat, over near the Dayton Country Club when this photo was taken in 1911. Of course, there were traces of the mound builders in Calvary Cemetery, some earthworks there that have been mostly lost to regrading, but a little bit left on the outside of the cemetery on what's now Carolyn Park's property at the top of the hill. Fast forward a few centuries to the era of the Woodlands Indians. They were here in this distribution in the Great Lakes area around 1600, and the Shawnee were the most prevalent in the southern Ohio area. Of course, the Miami were here also in the southwestern Ohio, hence the names of the rivers that we have. The first permanent settlers came to Dayton soon after the Treaty of Greenville was signed. Arrived on April Fool's Day of 1796, the Thompson's party came up the Miami River on a flatboat from Cincinnati, landed in the area where the Engineers Club is downtown, and were joined by a couple of other parties that came overland from Cincinnati soon after. Daniel Cooper arrived from Cincinnati a few months later. The summer of 1796, established a farm just south of Dayton. And he may have been the first person to really set up a home in Oakwood. His farm included a substantial log house, a grist mill, and a sawmill. In 1803, Colonel Robert Patterson made an agreement with Cooper to purchase Cooper's property to the south of Dayton. Patterson named his property Rubicon Farm. And so here is Colonel Robert Patterson, former militia member in Kentucky, founder of Lexington. He came up, purchased this property from Cooper. Here's an old illustration of what Rubicon Farm looked like. We're looking across the area to the south, across the landscape where the National Cash Register factories would later be. If you know where Flanagan's Pub is, an important landmark on Stewart Street, we're looking south from about that vantage point, way back a long time ago. And we're looking in the direction of what later was called 5 Points in Oakwood. So we have Brown Street, Main Street converging here. This is part of Rubicon Farm, and we see the far hills of Oakwood in the background. This is Robert Patterson's first home on Rubicon Farm. Illustration from the museum in Cincinnati, probably the present-day Point Oakwood area. Every description that I've read of the Pattersons' presence there suggests right about in that Point Oakwood area, and if this is a faithful representation, this may be the hill where the sugar camp was. And so my best guess is that it stood right in this area, just on this side of the Element apartment building. Maybe that's an educated guess. I'm not sure if anybody knows if there's any record of exactly where the home stood. Patterson was a successful farmer and businessman. He eventually acquired over 2,000 acres in the South Dayton area, including land in present-day Oakwood. Colonel Patterson completed portions of this house in 1816. So he moved his family across what's now Main Street to this home, of course, the Patterson homestead down on Brown Street. By 1822, there were several other taxpayers holding land in present-day Oakwood. Some data courtesy of Deborah David Warman, 160 acres. Later owned approximately 700 acres. The Schroyer families, conspicuous residents in the South Dayton area, owned a lot of land. Robert Wade, Henry Bacon, Joseph Coleman, Adam Koblenz owned some property in the area where Hills and Dales Park would later be. This was all part of Dayton Township back in those days. So where Oakwood is now, part of Dayton Township, and it wasn't until later in the century that Van Buren Township was carved from portions of Dayton Township and Washington Township. Patterson died in 1827 at Rubicon Farm, happy knowing that the Miami and Erie Canal was being constructed, and so that his sons would have the opportunity to ship Rubicon Farm's products to wider markets. This memorial to Colonel Robert Patterson stands at Oakwood's 5 Points, surrounded by these beautiful canna lilies. Patterson's son and daughter inherited Rubicon Farm. Jefferson Patterson was the youngest. He married Julia Johnston of Troy. The couple's children included John Henry Patterson. He was born on Rubicon Farm in 1844, and we'll talk about this young man some more in a moment. The 4 Mile Tavern was an early landmark in present-day Oakwood. The tavern, according to an old newspaper article, built about 1811 along the stagecoach route between Dayton and points to the south, stood on Lebanon Pike at about the future intersection of Far Hills and Hilltop Avenue. So if you picture the late great Flyboys Deli and come a skosh north, maybe out toward the street a little bit, I think that's about where the 4 Mile Tavern stood, named because it was 4 miles from its location to the center of Dayton. So a roadhouse. Information is sparse about the 4 Mile Tavern. This is the only other photograph that I've seen of it. We know it was a polling place for Van Buren Township. It was called the Van Buren Hotel for a short time. Oakwood lore has it that some of the early, the people who were looking to establish Oakwood incorporate Oakwood met there. Apparently it was raised in 1911, according to the newspaper articles, and I hope we can find some more information about it in the future. What was originally known as the Miami Canal opened in 1829 between Dayton and Cincinnati. It became known as the Miami and Erie Canal after it was completed to Lake Erie in 1845. So a continuous waterway all the way from the Ohio River up to Lake Erie, an important trade route before the railroads were established. The canal helped spur economic development. Farmers, manufacturers able to get their products to wider markets. Here we are looking up the canal from about 3rd Street. This is now present-day Patterson Boulevard in downtown Dayton. So if you picture the area where the main library is downtown, you got that locked in your head. We're looking north from that area, and some of these buildings still stand down there, including the Canal Street Tavern way back in here somewhere. Daniel Cooper moved into the town after he sold that land to Patterson and built that mill right there. So that would be kind of in the area where the ballpark is now. Prior to the city of Oakwood's purchase in 2006 of the Old River athletic fields, the route of the canal defined a portion of Oakwood's northwestern municipal boundary. So here we are at the Element again. The Miami and Erie Canal came in from the north, curved around the bottom of the hill, and continued over into the area where Carillon Park is now, much like this, and much like we see in this vintage shot. So this is looking into the sugar camp area, the canal. This is where the kids play soccer now, and by then the electric railroad ran through there. If you squint your eyes, you may be able to make out the double tracks of the railroad running through there, and we see the poles that held the wires for the railroad. The Long Romsport homestead was constructed yonder in the 1860s in what was then Van Buren Township. Oakwood's pioneering citizens, Henry Long and Harriet Schroyer Long, lived in the homestead. And if you keep your eye on this eave up here, the homestead, of course, is now the House Museum for the Historical Society. William Kramer, a German immigrant, purchased a piece of Oakwood right here in 1855. So this, of course, the city. We're south of the city, just to the west, the southwest of 5 Points. William Kramer's property. He planted trees and flowers and vineyards and formed the Kramer Winery and Pleasure Gardens, a place for people to go, get away from the heat and the dust of the city and come out and enjoy a glass of wine. This is the only illustration we have of the Pleasure Gardens from about 1875. But it operated for some decades. Here we have a newspaper article, ad, wines at reduced rates, Kramer's Wine Garden, south of Dayton. So you can come out and get a glass of wine, enjoy the fresh air in the countryside. George Houck, a Dayton lawyer, purchased property that he called Runnymede about 1856. He was a neighbor of Kramer's. This is George and his wife, Eliza Phillips Thruston Houck. So that name Thruston you see on the street signs, that's where that came from. By all accounts I've heard of her, she was a real fireball. I think if there's one person I could go back and meet in time, it would be Eliza. This is what Runnymede looked like in the 1890s. This is a detail of an Olmsted map showing you the location of Runnymede. So here's the 5 Points area. And if you're familiar with contour lines on topo maps, you see they're coming up the hill. So we're right up at the top of the hill, southwest of 5 Points. Jefferson Patterson died in 1863. In 1806, the Patterson family partitioned, sold portions of their inherited Rubicon land holdings. So a lot of these weren't actually sold, but this was sold to the southeast of Rubicon Homestead. Right up here, George Houck and his law partner, John McMahon, who I wish we had more time to talk about. He was maybe Dayton's greatest lawyer ever. He wrote the Conservancy Act after the flood. They purchased the eastern tract. Jacob Stickel and Gus Sander, who were German-born employees of a brewery co-owned by Sander's father, purchased the tract to the west. Stickel and Sander were members of the Dayton Sharpshooters Society, which began holding regular shooting matches at what became known as Oakwood Park. They also liked dogs, too. They bred dogs. So this went on for decades, these big shooting matches in present-day Oakwood. Here's an article from 1877 in the Cincinnati Enquirer. Oakwood Park is to be seasonally reopened soon, the main feature of which will be a beer garden, and daily pigeon and glass ball shooting matches. So we have these German guys drinking beer and shooting these massive firearms in Oakwood. Times have changed. These were massively popular. There's newspaper articles talking about these big prizes and all these visitors, all these guys doing the shooting. So I think that this may have had something to do with rail car service being established from the city to the south of town. In 1871, investors established rail car service between the city and the present-day Five Points intersection. Here is our 1875 county atlas again. We have the horse-drawn rail car going back towards town in front of the Patterson homestead. In 1872, 4 investors established the first plat in the heart of Oakwood. These investors were Isaac Haas, Patterson Mitchell, who was active in the YMCA, William Dixon, who we haven't yet found a picture of, and Gabriel Harmon. Harmon was probably the best known of these investors. He was a banker and he had his hand in several businesses. His farmhouse stood along present-day Far Hills Avenue, as we see in this 1875 atlas. Here is a news magazine article from 1913. He died in 1894, but this is a photograph showing the Harmon house on Far Hills Avenue, the house he built for his mother and his sisters. Keep an eye on that rock right there. Some of you know where I'm going with this. Gabriel Harmon passed away in 1894, like the other 3 Oakwood investors. Harmon was interred at Woodland Cemetery, and his graves and the other founders are part of the walking tour that is going to be held again this fall at Woodland. Isaac Haas, one of the investors, built Ravenswood, this home at East Shantz and Sorrento Avenue in 1880. And here's a vintage look at it back when the main entrance faced South Brown Street. So you come up and greet Haas at the front door there. In the 1880s, 2 of George and Eliza Houck's children became acquainted with a brother and sister from the Talbot family of Cincinnati. On separate occasions in 1887, brother and sister married sister and brother. And they all went by not their first names. Thruston Houck, Kitty's brother, married Lily Talbot, and Harry Talbot married Kitty Houck. And these 2 later resided at Runnymede, and they were up at about the top of Oakwood's social circles in the latter part of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1884, John H. Patterson had purchased a struggling company making a little-known device called a cash register. Through steady improvements to the machines, aggressive advertising, generous sales commissions to his agents, Patterson had great success with his National Cash Register Company. Here's a very early cash register, and here's one, much more advanced one from just a few years later. In 1888, the National Cash Register Company built a new factory building on the grounds of Rubicon Farm, way to the north end of the farm, just southwest of the intersection of Brown and Stewart Streets. That is the top of the chapel over at University of Dayton to get you oriented. While making worker welfare efforts in the 1890s, Patterson decided to improve the appearance of the factory grounds and the surrounding neighborhood. He was trying to make the factory a nice place for workers to work and clients to come and visit. Here is a view looking across the street from just north of where Holy Angels Church is now. Not the most inspiring sight then, but he called upon the expertise of John Charles Olmsted, a landscape architect from Massachusetts. His father was Frederick Law Olmsted, maybe best known as the designer of Central Park in New York City. Olmsted came to town. His firm directed many landscaping improvements to the NCR factory grounds over the years. Here's the factory looking a little nicer. Olmsted's philosophy was avoid straight lines in your garden beds, plant in clusters, and leave lots of open spaces. The Olmsted firm also consulted on many projects in Oakwood and elsewhere in the South Dayton area, so this is some valuable information for those of you researching local history. If you go online to their map and zoom in, we see the South Dayton area. And each of these dots represents an Olmsted project, and you can click on those, sometimes find drawings, photographs, maps, correspondence, field notes, wonderful source of information that they're digitizing and making available. They worked from the time they started with Patterson all the way up until I think their last project might have been the NCR Country Club in the 1950s. In 1898, golf came to Oakwood when the Dayton Golf Club was established, and the organization leased property in Oakwood from the Houck family for a 9-hole golf course. This view from near the Houck family's Runnymede home shows the Oakwood Links. So this is a 9-hole golf course just to the west of 5 Points. We're looking to the north from about the intersection of West Thrueston and Southview over there. They had tennis courts at the far end, just on this side of West Shantz, a clubhouse here, just off of 5 Points. 5 Points we can't see, would be right over in here, and the National Cash Register factory there in the background. Here is a postcard view of the clubhouse that stood right here. So 5 Points right here. Couple of big Tudor homes that belonged to the Kuntz families right here, and this clubhouse stood kind of in the backyards of where those houses are now. The clubhouse stood just across 5 Points from what became John H. Patterson's Far Hills estate. So clubhouse on this side, we come across 5 Points to Far Hills. In 1899, Patterson purchased these 2 large tracts that had been sold by his family before. He called his estate Far Hills because it stood on the far hills to the south of the city. In 1902, he built a new summer home at Far Hills. He later made a permanent move from his downtown home out to Far Hills. So here it is under construction. In 1902, the Swiss-style architecture was popular at this time. There's some other examples in Oakwood and a bunch in Cincinnati. A little bit of craftsman-style influence there, and he loved the Adirondack area of upstate New York, so he had a rustic influences here too. Here's what it looked like when it was done. This stood in the area where the Lutheran Church of Our Savior is at the top of the hill on East Thrueston. He had a gatehouse to Far Hills at 5 Points, so this spanned the main entrance to his estate. We're looking to the east on what is now East Thrueston coming off of 5 Points. So here's the loop in the rail cars. Talk about that in a moment. Everybody know where we are. We're coming down Far Hills Avenue here. Oakwood Avenue goes that way, and Main Street continues. Patterson enjoyed entertaining, and he held massive gatherings at Far Hills. Here is a view from 1905. He had just come back from a trip around the world. He had photographers with him, took a whole bunch of images that were on glass slides, these lantern slides, and he gave this enormous slideshow. He's probably over in here somewhere, and you see these hotter than Hades lamps that projected these images onto a screen to this audience of 10,000 guests. Probably many of them had never seen the ocean, let alone seen a foreign country. So this must have been, amazing to them. You see far hills here silhouetted in the background. So if you're ever coming up East Threwston, like walking up the hill from Shantz, and you're coming up the hill and your church is on the right, there's a hillside there, formed kind of a natural amphitheater for this. So next time you're walking up there, see if you can imagine 10,000 people sprawled all over there watching a slideshow. Patterson had a great view of the Miami Valley, the city of Dayton, and of course his NCR factory from Far Hills. You know, if you go up to the Lutheran church, and especially when the leaves are down, you check out the view from the parking lot there. It's wonderful. In 1906, Patterson began purchasing land for what became Hills and Dales Park. And so he worked with John Charles Olmsted. He said, this is a nice piece of land here and here. So he kind of coached Patterson on what to buy. This is a map from about that 1906, 1907 time frame, showing some of the purchased land. Patterson had fought and fought and fought with the city of Dayton to try to establish a public park. He got disgusted and took it into his own hands in 1906. There's a whole lesson in this map about local history. The Shantz estate was established in 1907, so the following year. Here is the area: Oakwood Avenue, Irving Avenue, East Shantz coming up here. A little bit of background on that. In 1880, a German immigrant and successful brewer named Adam Shantz purchased 108 acres of land adjacent to Ravenswood on the route of the railway. So as our good friend Tom Morrow has pointed out, if you wanted to sell land for residential property, you needed to provide transportation into the city. And so here's the Shantz Plat adjacent to the route of the streetcar. After purchasing the property, Shantz reportedly called his family together and said something to the effect, "I have acquired 108 acres of land in Oakwood. It is my firm conviction and belief that Oakwood will someday become the most desirable residence district in Dayton." But he died in 1902. Here is his monument at Woodland Cemetery. Soon after it was placed, it looks like his grave is right there behind it. And if you go to Woodland Cemetery, his monument is very conspicuous there by the front entrance. However, his son Adam Jr. inherited his father's business acumen and carried his father's vision forth, and in 1907 platted what was given the kind of the clunky name Adam Shantz's Estate subdivision, better known as the Shantz Estate Plat. The Shantz Grove stood at the eastern end, became a favored destination for picnics and recreation. So people didn't have to go quite as far as Hills and Dales Park. They could come out to the Shantz Grove for a picnic and a little bit of fun. A lookout tower stood on the hill overlooking the grove. So this is present day lookout coming up to this high point right here. And if you're driving around in those streets up there, again, with the leaves are down, you have a wonderful view of the city from up there. Here is the tower. So you go in, go up the steps, zip, 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 up 5 floors. And if we go up there and look out to the northwest, here's what it looks like. Beautiful view into the National Cash Register Factory Complex, what's now the University of Dayton Student Housing. Here's the Shantz Plat, and I'm saying 1912. That's constrained by the fact that you don't see many houses there yet. You see the roads lined out and the trees that are planted. In 1913, houses started popping up in here. We do see the Shantz double family house there, that Victorian-style house along East Schanze. The Schanze Park Historic District was entered in 1992 in the U.S. National Park Service's National Register of Historic Places, and some of Oakwood's finest homes are down in that plat. The Society makes available a self-guided walking tour with information about the architectural styles of the homes, who some of the architects were, and who lived in some of those homes. My background's in geology, so I have to give a plug to the Dayton limestone. If you look at some of the older houses in Oakwood, you can distinguish some of the early ones by these cut stone foundations. This is local bedrock that was quarried here in the Dayton area for many years. The same kind of rock that went into the old courthouse in downtown Dayton. And it just so happens that I think the June issue of Oakwood Living will be running an essay about the Dayton limestone. As our good friend Mark Risley has pointed out, there's a wonderful example of craftsman, aka arts and crafts style architecture down there that's characteristic of the first decade or two of the 20th century. This is a textbook craftsman style home there on Volusia, I believe. As Mark has pointed out, there's many features of this style of architecture. Clipped gable, natural stone chimney, natural colors used in the paint, exposed roof brackets, you see those on a number of houses, exposed beams, and other features characteristic of this wonderful craftsman style architecture that we have here in Oakwood. Oakwood became a village in 1908 after a successful vote to incorporate. The vote was taken here at District School number 7. I have a better picture coming up later where the people voted in favor of incorporation Monday. The schoolhouse is located near the junction of the Lebanon and Cincinnati Pikes, aka Far Hills and West Schanze. So this stood in the sugar camp area. In February of 1908, Harry Talbot was elected first mayor of the village of Oakwood after an election held at John H. Patterson's Far Hills estate. So he swore in later his council. In about 1907, the Dayton Golf Club changed its name to the Dayton Country Club. The organization also formed plans to purchase the nearby Kramer property and moved there from the 9-hole Oakwood links that it leased from the Houck family. So the Dayton Golf Club evolved into the Dayton Country Club and moved over to the winery and pleasure gardens. Dayton Country Club formally opened its new clubhouse on June 18, 1910. And so we'd be looking at a swimming pool nowadays from this same perspective. A love story began there. Let's have a love story. Before a dinner at the Dayton Country Club in 1912, during a horse show, Thomas Watson, who was the sales manager at NCR, and Jeanette Kittredge were unacquainted. They didn't know one another. Both of them abstained from drinking alcohol. They were teetotalers. At a time when posh events, they poured the wine flowed at otherwise. During the dinner, both of them noticed from across the room theirs were the only wine glasses left untouched. The couple met and fell in love. They became engaged later in 1912 and planned to be married the following year. John H. Patterson was acquainted with her family. Watson was high. He was a mentor to Watson, and he said, "I always hoped you would marry that girl." They planned to be married, and then something happened. Of course, March 25 of 1913, Dayton had an enormous flood. The National Cash Register stood on high ground. Here is a look at the very swollen Miami River from probably the top of the office building. John H. Patterson saw that the flood was coming. He was in his element. He was born to lead and to plan and foresee and direct. He called an emergency meeting together, said, you're going to do this, you this, you this, you this. They built boats. They rounded up food from wherever they could find, had plenty there on hand also. His daughter Dorothy helped prepare food. He had his people scour the countryside for supplies, knock on farmers' doors to round up food and blankets and clothing. Called in his personnel, had people go out and round up doctors and nurses and bring them to NCR. And after he gave all those orders, he went down to the edge of the floodwaters there at the bottom of Fairgrounds Hill and supervised them bringing in the people, and then they were ushered to his factory complex. Oakwood citizens assisted with the rescue and relief efforts. Here's a page from a news magazine showing some of the Oakwood people who helped. In the city, Bud Talbot, the younger of the two boys of Kitty and Harry Talbot, and his friend Fred Patterson, John H.'s son, were credited with rescuing 162 people trapped by the floodwaters using only their canoe. They were good friends. Bud was, a few months later, scheduled to be the best man at Fred's wedding. He had become engaged, but that engagement fell through. He was unlucky in some of his earlier relationships. Ohio Governor James M. Cox appointed Oakwood's General George H. Wood in charge of martial law in Dayton. Cox also appointed Harry Talbot with the title of colonel and placed him in charge of cleanup efforts in Dayton. So he got to be in charge of cleaning up all the muck, and he hired a bunch of men from Chicago and brought them here. And the story goes is that the banks were closed, checks couldn't be cashed, paper money wasn't allowed to be circulated for fears of contamination. So Talbot had to arrange for hundreds of thousands of dollars of silver to be brought up from banks in Cincinnati so that he could pay the workers. A flood prevention campaign raised over $2 million. John H. Patterson spearheaded this. Was pretty good at kind of twisting some arms a little bit to get people to pony up some cash. A giant cash register at 3rd and Main in front of the courthouse kept a running tally. It was a big weekend, and on Sunday night he called a meeting of people at NCR, and who's going to double, who's going to triple. And they raised over $2 million, and they came back downtown, made a big grand parade, and celebrated in front of the old courthouse. Here is Orville and Wilbur's sister, Catherine, at Patterson's side. Several Oakwood citizens were involved in the Miami Conservancy Commission that worked on flood prevention later on. Adam Shantz Jr., his brother-in-law, Edward Sauer, among them. Thomas Watson was in New York when the flood struck. He was up there with his wife and their family getting his bride-to-be's wedding trousseau together. And while he was up there, he used his connections to round up food and blankets. Social workers, medicine, medical people sent them on trains to Dayton. Thomas and Jeanette were finally married in April of 1913 in the Kittredge home in downtown Dayton. I think it was in the old Roberts Boulevard neighborhood, that posh neighborhood that stood down there. It was freshly scrubbed after having been immersed in floodwaters. They took an extended honeymoon through the U.S. West. When they got back, John H. Patterson handed Thomas Watson the keys to High Acres, which Patterson had built for the Watsons as a summer home in Hills and Dales Park. Watson left NCR in 1914. He later became chairman and basically founded and CEO of IBM, International Business Machines. He was a pioneer in the development of accounting and computing equipment and one of the most notable businessmen of the 20th century. I don't think it's widely known that he lived in what's now Oakwood for a while. High Acres passed into the hands of the merchant Fred Reich. The original home was demolished in about 1927 and the newer home built on the site. A garage that matches that architectural style still remains. So this is over near the Ridgeway Road Bridge. If you're walking past the home and look down at the garage, you'll see this, it looks much like the old house, that same architectural style as the former house. About early 1912, Orville and Wilbur Wright, with the encouragement of their sister Catherine, began acquiring land in Oakwood. They planned to build a house. Here's an article from early 1912 talking about one of the lots they were buying contains about 6 acres. If I understand correctly, they had a total of about 17 acres in the area where Hawthorne Hill is now. Unfortunately, Wilbur died before the new house was complete. Here's his funeral procession coming through the main gateway at Woodland Cemetery in June 1st, 1912. In the spring of 1914, Orville, Catherine, and Bishop Milton Wright moved to the newly completed Hawthorne Hill in Oakwood. And here they are, Orville, his sister Catherine, and their father, Bishop Milton Wright. They're on this eastern porch, which overlooks the intersection of Park Avenue and Harmon Avenue. I want to turn our attention to Park Hill. This is the name of this plat right here in northeastern Oakwood. To get your bearings, this is the OCC over here. This is Far Hills, the city building up here, St. Paul's Church, Patterson Road, Shantz Avenue, and what do we have? Patterson, Dixon, Wisteria, Byria, down here, Beverly in there. So it's that neighborhood. Here's the junior high and high school. This was the first plat in what we think of as East Oakwood, this grid of streets in where we are now. Platted in 1912 by the Spate and Wright Realty Company. Here's an advertising postcard for Park Hill and some more advertising. Buy a lot at Park Hill in beautiful Oakwood. By the way, it's 275 feet higher than 3rd and Main Street. A lot of these ads in the sort of World War I time frame playing off of people's flood fears, having similar phrases on them. City streetcar service by August 1st. So again, if you wanted to sell real estate in the outlying areas, you needed to provide a way for people to get into the town for work and doctor's appointments and shopping. So they're promising you could ride the rail car. A little bit of background to catch up. In 1895, the Oakwood Street Railway converted from the horse-drawn power to electric power and ran to a southern loop at 5 points. So it would come up from the city, stop in the loop, and then turn around and go back into the city. Here is the loop at 5 points shown clearly on this map. So the loop was brought eventually up the hill, up Far Hills Avenue, and it was successively extended to the south as Oakwood grew. On a side note, we see here at 5 points, Main Street here, Oakwood Avenue here, what's labeled as Houck Road, 5 streets coming together. So I think this is the origin of 5 points, and now East Threwston comes up here. So it's 6 points now at 5 points. Here's a photo from a news magazine, waiting for the streetcar at the log cabin corner. So here's some ladies waiting in that loop area for the streetcar at 5 points. Across the street from them would be Patterson's gatehouse to his Far Hills estate that we looked at. Log cabin, you see log cabin right there on the map. That refers to Robert Patterson's log cabin that stood there at 5 points. So John H. learned that his grandfather's log cabin was still standing in Lexington. He dispatched some guys to go down there, purchase it, bring it up to 5 Points. It rested there in pieces for a while until they finally reassembled it, and it was unveiled at that big party where he had all those people that we saw a moment ago in 1905. And it stood there in honor of his grandfather and the pioneer spirit of his grandfather's time. Stood there until the late 1930s when Lexington expressed the interest in having it back, and it went back to Lexington, and it still stands on the lawn at Transylvania University in Lexington. Patterson died in May of 1922. Frederick Patterson replaced his father's home at Far Hill. So where this Swiss-style mansion stood was replaced by this, which forms the western part of the Lutheran Church of Our Savior. And if we were looking at this modern-day view, we'd have a big sanctuary blocking a lot of our view. Harry Talbot died the year before while on a golf course in Miami, Florida. He enjoyed golfing, so he went out of this world doing something that he enjoyed. After Harry's passing, Catherine Kitty Houck Talbot traveled extensively, remained active in social and philanthropic organizations in the Dayton area. She was a singer. She supported the singing societies. Continued residing at Runnymede. In 1927, she arranged for the construction of the Runnymede Playhouse, which she dedicated to art, music, and sports, and placed just to the southeast of the Runnymede Mansion. So here it is under construction in that 1927 time frame. The Playhouse stood over 2 stories tall and was the largest freestanding private hall in the U.S. at the time it was built. The Playhouse had a high ceiling and glass roof over an area that was large enough for 1,200 women to play bridge. I don't think I see any men in this photograph. There's someone looking from the stage here. Here is the posh box lounge area on the second level of the Playhouse, overlooking the main floor. Down here, here's the stage at one end, flanked by separate dressing rooms, so beautiful facility. Here's an aerial shot of, I think, about the time the Playhouse was completed. Of course, we have Hawthorne Hill here, Harmon School over here, and if you were right at home, you got to look at some of the homes in the neighborhood there. Here is the Runnymede Playhouse. If you dropped the playground ball at the side of the building at Harmon School and chased it down the hill and beyond the stop sign, it would end up about the area where the Playhouse stood at Dixon and Runnymede. Here's the Runnymede Mansion up here. Kitty Houck passed away in 1935 at age 71, soon after the birth of her 35th grandchild. I wonder if they had to wear name tags. And the Historical Society is very fortunate to have this beautiful portrait of Catherine Houck Talbot on display over at the homestead. She, again, was an opera singer. After Kitty's passing, the Playhouse continued to house family and community gatherings. This photo shows the Talbot family at Christmas dinner at the Playhouse in 1938. The stage at that end. In 1944, the Playhouse took on a very different role. Working as part of the World War II Dayton project, the Monsanto Company converted the Playhouse into a top-secret, high-security laboratory for processing polonium, a rare radioactive metal used as a trigger for nuclear reactions. So that went on there for some years. Finally, in late 1948, processing of polonium was transferred from the Runnymede Playhouse to the Mound Laboratory at Miamisburg. By that time, the interior of the Playhouse was considered to be too contaminated by radiation to be repairable, so it was dismantled. In February of 1950, the components trucked away for secure disposal at a landfill, and much of the soil dug up and hauled away also. In 2017, Harry's and Kitty's great-granddaughter, Linda Carrick Thomas, published Polonium in the Playhouse, the Manhattan Project's secret chemistry work in Dayton, Ohio. So you can learn all about what went on there from her book. Turning our attention to Joe Desch. You may have seen the latest issue of the Oakwood Register, had his photograph on the front. Joe Desch pioneered electric research. He headed the electrical department at National Cash Register beginning in 1938. He went by Joe. He was a longtime Oakwood resident who led the U.S. Navy's efforts to design and build a machine to read and decipher coded messages sent from the Nazi military command to its forces in the field. Desch's work helped to shorten the war and save numerous lives. And Andrew and Cheryl Lloyd have been working to more fully have Joe Desch honored and recognized here in Oakwood. He was assisted by the Navy Waves, the women accepted for volunteer emergency service. They assisted in building the decryption machines. The Waves were housed at NCR's Sugar Camp facility, which was training grounds for National Cash Register sales agents and salesmen. This photo shows the Waves leaving Sugar Camp for the NCR factory. So they would reside at Sugar Camp and parade from the factory, from Sugar Camp down to NCR's factory, come out the front, walk down West Schanze to Far Hills Avenue, come down Far Hills Avenue. This is the modern day Dayton and Oakwood border, and onwards from there. Going back in time, here we see the Waves marching along, and I knew a woman who used to see them, and she aspired, she loved how proper they looked and aspired to be one. So they worked in Building 26 at NCR. Here's a photograph of Joe Desch, some Navy officers, and a bunch of the Waves there at Building 26. They all look pretty happy.
So my mother had seen this about the Navy, looking for girls of good character, and had to be 21, and never been married. That I was a good candidate, she said. From Hamlet, got the train that day, and we went to New York, got off of the train, and somebody met us there and took us out to Hunter College. Now, Hunter College at that time had been a girls' school, and the Navy had taken it over for training the Waves. I was in the 2nd Regiment of the enlisted women that went through. We had retired Marines that were banged up, and they were doing the training us. But we finished that, and they sent us to Washington, D.C. But this was the funny part of it. We lived in barracks they had made just for all the extra people they needed. Well, the civilian men were the watchmen and checked us in as we went through. We had some of them there sang a song, "She had a good home and she left it." And that's what they sang to us every time we went in that door. And, it was, I don't know, it was funny in a way, and in a way they just tried to make us homesick, I think. Because that's where we gave us all our aptitude tests and see what we could do and couldn't do. And we were glad to get out of that. And then they sent us, the next thing was a bus trip to Dayton, Ohio. We had no idea where we were going. They didn't tell us where we were going. We were going. And if you had ever been to Sugar Camp, of course, you know what that was. It was a salesman training place for the NCR. They put us all in one of the larger buildings. They fixed it in for beds. We could all have bunk beds, and we fit in one of those. We had a big room, and there was these workbenches in there, and I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 of us sat on each side of the booth. We had commutators that they weren't finished or anything. We got those, and we had to be careful with them. That moved in that machine to find the right spot for the letters of the code. It was a computer, is what it ended up as. It's just a computer, huge computer. When we finally bombed the ships over in, of Germans' ships, then Commander Meter came out to the camp and told us, ladies, you did it. We said, we did what? And he says, you bombed the ships, so now we can get rid of the Germans. Because they were making a mess of us. The Germans were really tearing us apart about that time, so we needed that code breaker to kill their code. And we did it. Thank you for honoring me today and for being here through the wonderful years of Dayton and through the war. People in Dayton were special people. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Wright Library opened in 1939. Here is a photograph of it under construction in the late 1930s time frame. The original front part looks very much, from what I understand, like it did when it first opened in 1939. Here's a plaque. In honor of Wilbur Orville and Catherine Wright, this building is named the Wright Library, right there by the front door. Dorothy Lane Market began as a fruit stand in 1948 at the intersection of Far Hills Avenue and Dorothy Lane. Here is Calvin Main, one of the two original business partners at Dorothy Lane Market. In about early 1953, the Talbot family had a hand in constructing the building where Dorothy Lane's current location is. This is the grand opening, August 5th of 1953. So right up there where the cash registers still are, and I am seasoned enough to remember when the aisles still were arranged diagonally like that. In November 1952, the citizens of Van Buren Township voted in favor of incorporating the village of Kettering. That pretty much put an end to Oakwood's expansion. So that kind of landlocked Oakwood, and so its boundaries haven't changed a whole lot since then. What was the layout of Oakwood then is very similar to what it is now. It did pick up that little bit of property north of the Point Oakwood area later on. Here's a look at the Far Hills Business District in the early 1960s, a nice aerial shot. This is Dorothy Lane, Far Hills Avenue. Here is Dorothy Lane Market, the 2600 building. This was Winter's Bank building, so some familiar buildings are still there. This medical building is gone, so some of these, of course, that bank was recently gone, so some of these buildings are now missing. If we go to the other end, here we are looking to the south at Peach Orchard. Tropical Smoothie to get your bearings right about in here. You can always use a food reference and the light bulb, kind of goes on. Back in this day, there was diagonal parking out here, and I think it was in the 1980s that they redid all of that. In July of 1972, a group of Oakwood youth decided to celebrate a birthday by forming and marching a 20-member kazoo band. The event was considered to be a parade held without the benefit of a permit, and 3 of the members were chosen more or less at random and arrested. 2 of them pleaded guilty. A third one pleaded not guilty, was found guilty in an Oakwood court. The case appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court, which tossed it out. Got lots of attention from the media. The media whipped up a storm. Seemed like by the following year, all the ruffled feathers had been plucked, and a second parade was held, this time with permits, going down Schaefer Boulevard, I believe. So that you can see that they've gathered some kids. The kazoo band reunited for the parade in Oakwood's first that day in May in 1976. So here they are in the lineup for the parade, number 22, the kazoo band. That day in May, the first one was held in May of 1976 as Oakwood saluted America's bicentennial, and that has been a tradition ever since. This is the lineup for the one in 2024. Before we finish up, a brief look at Oakwood schools. This is the little red brick schoolhouse at the future 5 Points, and so this is where John H. Patterson went to school as a boy in the middle of the 19th century. District School number 7, which we saw a moment ago in that grainy shot, that was built a little later in the 19th century, a single-room schoolhouse there in the Sugar Camp area, near where Point Oakwood is now. The Green Barn Schoolhouse was a barn converted to a schoolhouse used for a few years at the site of where Harmon School is now, Harmon Elementary. Speaking of which, in early 1913, the Dayton Daily News announced that Oakwood Village was to have a new school called the Oakwood Village School when it opened up. Notice the name Louis Lott, architect, on here, this drawing. He was an accomplished architect, had a studio, I think out on Salem Avenue, lived sometimes with some families in Oakwood, and he designed some of Oakwood's finest houses. Harmon School was completed in 1913. Here's what it looked like originally. Of course, it has expanded and expanded and expanded ever since. Oakwood High School, completed in 1924. Here it is along Far Hills Avenue. This is maybe 1927-ish. There's a lot of aerial photos from around 1927. The junior high wasn't completed yet, and the football stadium was some years away. The Oakwood High School, again, completed in 1924. Here's a vintage shot along Far Hills Avenue. Note the tracks of the Oakwood Street Railway had been extended progressively to the south. Here's a similar modern view. And remember when I asked you to keep an eye on that rock in Harmon's front yard? So now you know where Gabriel Harmon's house stood. Right there, they built the high school on the Harmon farm. Edwin Smith School, here's a modern day look at that on Schaefer Boulevard. It was originally called the Schaefer Boulevard School when it opened in 1926. This photograph taken probably not long after they hadn't planted the ginkgo trees yet. Oakwood Junior High was completed in 1931, a nice aerial shot of that, maybe about the time it was being completed. I see the lawns haven't been fixed up yet. The football stadium was built in 1937, so this constrains the photograph to early 1930s time frame. Another nice look at the high school and the junior high. Before the stadium was built, you see East Oakwood filling out back here. I like this shot because we see Far Hills Avenue and then the little shift in the street railway tracks coming down the median of what's now Far Hills Avenue. Mark, in his talk about the classic architecture of Oakwood, has addressed what a wonderful job Oakwood has done with maintaining the architectural integrity as it's expanded its public buildings, and the new Performing Arts Edition is no exception to the junior high and high school. Many sections built at different times, but unless you're looking really close, here, like the other schools in the city building, look pretty much continuous in their architecture. The Historical Society is celebrating its golden anniversary this year, so the Society is off to a great start. What a great time for people to get involved, officers, board members, researchers, docents, and so forth. Needed by the Society. And a big tip of the hat to those of you who help with speaking and serving as docents for house tours. Linda there with the kids in the garden, and Deborah with her initiatives, including the various plaques that have gone up. So that is it for me tonight. Thank you so much for your attention.